September 27th, 2011. We are here today with Gordon Beggs, who has a long history with the ACLU of Ohio and ACLU of Cleveland. From 1973, he got his start with the organization and served as the executive director until 1976. In 1976, he moved to the ACLU of Ohio, where he served as staff counsel for the Project on the Rights of the Institutionalized until 1979, when he took the position as legal director and staff counsel for the ACLU of Cleveland until 1989, and he wrapped up his career with the ACLU as the legal director for the ACLU of Ohio up until 1991. Your interviewer today is Colleen Benoit, History Associate for the ACLU of Ohio Foundation. Gordon, thanks so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Colleen.
So Gordon, where were you born?
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And what year?
1947.
Describe your childhood and your family for us.
Well, I am a second-generation American, which is kind of unusual for a WASP. My grandfather was a Scottish immigrant carpenter, lived in Glasgow at the beginning of the 1900s, came to the United States, was never naturalized. So his son, James, was my dad, and his wife, Lucetta, was my mom. I had two sisters, grew up in a small suburb of Philadelphia, Lansdowne, Pennsylvania.
And where did you attend college?
I went to the University of Pennsylvania.
What was your major?
History. Why would you ask me that question, Colleen? History major.
History. So tell me a little bit about your decision to attend law school and where you did your law degree.
Well, actually, President Nixon had a lot to do with the trajectory of my career. My goal had always been to be a history professor in college, and I built the kind of academic record that would support that through undergrad school. But in the late 1960s, looking at the state of this country and seeing what public interest lawyers were doing around issues of poverty, the Vietnam War, I decided to go to law school instead. And so I applied to the University of Pennsylvania and attended there. I guess to explain why I went to that school, I was dating Marcy Leopold, now Marcy Beggs, and she was going to college about 25 miles away, so I didn't want to venture too far from the home ground at that point.
And where was she attending college?
Westchester State University.
Okay. Well, as I said in the introduction, you've certainly held a whole array of positions with the ACLU of Ohio, but before that, you were very active in organizing a chapter of the ACLU on University of Pennsylvania's campus, and I believe you also interned with the organization in Pennsylvania. Can you talk a little bit about why that was important to you and how you first got involved with the ACLU?
Sure. As an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania, it was one of the schools that was active in anti-war and other protest demonstrations. And there was a significant problem that persisted for many years of Philadelphia police roughing up, sometimes unnecessarily arresting demonstrators. And so in conjunction with Pennsylvania ACLU staff, legal director Tom Harvey, longtime executive director Spencer Cox, we organized a small student chapter at the University of Pennsylvania to provide some support and advocacy around those issues. I actually surprisingly found one item which was a project that we did. This is a little informational card that went to students and demonstrators so they knew what to do if they were arrested, and they had contact information for the ACLU. I was appointed policy chair for that little student chapter, and I also surprisingly found the ACLU policy manual, which I was given. This is the second edition of the collection of policies of the ACLU and dates to 1967, which at this point makes it a fairly old document. I Also, when I went to Penn Law School, to answer the second part of your question, again, President Nixon's influence was felt on my career because I signed up for the clinical course and wanted to work for Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, the legal aid organization for the poor. At that point, President Nixon had impounded legal services funds. In other words, federal money to support the programs was not going out. And so none of the offices of Philadelphia Legal Aid would take any student placements. They thought they might have to close within a matter of months. And so after a couple of weeks wanting to get going with something, I thought of my activity during my undergrad time and went down to the Pennsylvania ACLU office and asked them if they would like to have a clinic student working with them for the year. And they were more than delighted to have me come on board. So I did work with them through the year. And after that, it was such a good experience, I applied for and got what was called a Law Student Civil Rights Research Council internship. This was a pretty prestigious internship. There were less than 50 in the entire United States. And I was hired by them to work as basically a law student, law clerk during the course of the summer. And then I continued with them into the fall after I finished the work and worked on the criminal justice and due process committees with them. So I was a volunteer long before I was an ACLU staff member.
So after you had concluded this experience with the ACLU of Pennsylvania, were you certain that you wanted to continue working with an ACLU chapter somewhere in the country? I was a young law student graduating, wanting to do public interest work. And I was graduating at a time where those jobs were few and far between. I was also graduating without, other than my student experience, litigation experience. And so I knew I wanted to do public interest work, and Spencer Cox was very helpful to me. He gave me the list of all the affiliate addresses and the directors, and I wrote places all over the United States. And as it turned out, I had a chance to work in Philadelphia doing a couple different kinds of public interest law. I had an offer in Cleveland to be executive director of the Cleveland ACLU, and I had something in the pipeline with the ACLU of Illinois, which had not yet matured. So at the time of my graduation, with $150 in my bank account, I took the Cleveland ACLU job and got into our very old and rather decrepit Volkswagen Beetle and drove out here to start the job. What attracted you to Cleveland?
Well, actually, my wife weighed in significantly there. She wanted to go someplace where we would start and we wouldn't be living within 1 square mile of our entire immediate family, which was the case at that point. But the other thing that was the main driver for me is that at this point, this is the May of 1973, the beginnings of the impeachment campaign for President Nixon. The same President Nixon were getting underway. And I felt that the job of executive director would give me some flexibility to do political kinds of things, and that was of interest to me. I felt that was important at this point.
So talk a little bit about what the operation was like when you arrived at the Cleveland office in 1973.
In a word, it was small. We were in an 8th floor corner office at 21st and Payne Avenue, which was called the Film Building. It was originally the headquarters for all the motion picture distributors in the greater Cleveland area. There was even a screening room in the building, which Max Wall sometimes frequented. I think I got there once. You could watch a new feature film that had come in that was open to people in the building. But a very small office. And in that office was Max Wall, who's well known, beloved by all, course, the building is named in his honor at this point, appropriately, I think. There was a young woman part-time on a federal job development program. I think her name was Wilma Scott. And then 2 law clerks, Marley Iger, who became a managing attorney at Lake County Legal Aid in Ohio, and Mark Frost, who had a successful career as a civil rights lawyer in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then I rounded out the entire staff.
How do you spell Marley's last name?
E-I-G-E-R.
So, aside from the people you just named, do you ever have any recollection of other volunteers you worked with, or perhaps members of the board?
I do, but before I start to answer this question, I have to offer an apology because your question is taking me back almost 40 years, and I will inevitably overlook somebody in trying to do this, but people who I remember as being important and active were, of course, Max, who served as intake coordinator. He took all the calls in the office. He did the bookkeeping for the organization at that point. He kept the membership records. He was the foundation upon which the Cleveland chapter was built. There was Harold Levine, who was the owner of United Insulation, chaired the resource committee, was the major fundraiser for the Cleveland ACLU. There was Eileen Roberts, who was a political activist in the McGovern campaign, who gravitated toward ACLU activity and worked as a volunteer to help organize the series of benefit concerts that we were doing as a fundraiser at that point for the ACLU. There was Ben Shearer, who was the chair of the board and a very active lawyer, did a pretty controversial case that predated Skokie, the famous Illinois case, by a few years. He represented successfully members of the American Nazi Party who wanted to wear their armbands to attend Cleveland City Council meetings, sit in the spectator section. They were excluded. He brought a suit in federal district court that secured their admission. He is the person who extended the offer to me to come to Cleveland to work with the ACLU, and it came in a very interesting form because he called me, I think, after the board meeting fairly late one night and told me that there was a job for me, explained the salary and the one benefit, Kaiser Health Insurance. And I, at that point, told him that I'd been thinking about the position and my options and talking to my wife, and I had made a decision that if I got the offer, I would take it. And he responded, "Well, I'm glad you're so positive because the vote to hire you was 10-9, and thus my ACLU career in Cleveland was launched."
Oh, that's funny. You had mentioned that you led a series of, or you participated in a series of benefit concerts. Can you talk a little bit about what those were like?
They were very special events. They'll be well remembered by longtime members. They were either at Severance Hall itself in the chamber concert venue, or across the street at Allen Memorial Library. We had volunteers from the Cleveland Orchestra who sort of formed the core of the people doing them. Through their connections, they recruited various soloists. Eunice Potus played the piano for us. At one point, very early on, we got a young pianist who, after we recruited him, won the Tchaikovsky International Piano Competition, and he came and played for us. His name was Emanuel Axe. Today, he's one of the greatest concert musicians as a pianist in the world. So they were very special.
Did they have a large attendance usually?
They had a very, very good attendance. Clevelanders loved their orchestra. They loved their classical music, so they were well supported.
Now, when you came to the Cleveland chapter, as I understand it, there had been an absence. There had been no executive director for a period of time. Am I correct in that?
Well, that's true. The previous director had been Norma Coffey. She served for a couple of years, and there was a hiatus before I started. You have asked a question, though, before I have finished listing key board people, and let me just add a couple more. See, it's amazing when I can keep the train on the track at this point. But a couple others that certainly come to mind would be Ellie Gerson, who very beloved member of the board. She was our representative in the foundation community, helped secure funding for a film on Fourth Amendment rights that was created as a project about the time I was started, helped us with foundation appeals throughout the years, and was a both wise and wonderful lady. Other people that come to mind would be some of the folks active in the legal program. Gene Baer was the legal committee chair. He will be remembered as a lively gentleman with a large stogie, a huge raucous laugh, a great sense of humor, and was probably the original paradigm for the point that you should question authority. Other attorneys that were quite active included Ralph Rudd, who had been on the board for many years. Quaker background, very active in selective service representation at that point. Nelson Carl was another longtime, very active volunteer. He participated actively in the Kent State litigation, which the Ohio ACLU undertook. I think fully participated in the retrial of the case. In other words, he was there every day. He also did a fun case that I participated in, which was a challenge to out-of-season and independent play by Ohio high school soccer players, where we represented all the players and their parents over a period of 10 years or so. There were about 25,000 people in this class, so it was a big case.
Do you recall the name of the case?
Anderson versus Ohio High School Athletic Association. And it's an interesting story because ultimately we lost the case, but what happened was, I think we set the record for perhaps what was the longest running temporary restraining orders in the history of litigation. The case was filed, and the original judge issued a restraining order to keep the regulations from being effective for 20 days. By rule, that could be extended 10 days. Or the parties could agree that it could extend until trial, which they did. Well, the trial didn't occur until probably 8 or so years after the case was initiated. How did that happen? Well, this case wasn't a football, it was about a soccer ball, but none of the federal judges seemed to particularly want to try this case. As new judges came onto the court, prior judges could assign them cases to create their docket, and this case got reassigned and reassigned and reassigned and reassigned. And finally, Judge Sam Bell tried the case. At that point, I tried it with Kurt Eisler, who was a volunteer attorney from Hardert and Haddon. It was a three-day trial in federal district court, and Judge Bell ruled against us. However, he issued a stay pending appeal, which meant that our restraining order remained effective for another couple of years. And so it was effectively about a 9-year restraining order. Why is this important? Well, generations of high school players in Ohio played under the protection of these rules, which allowed them to play with independent soccer organizations out of season and allowed them to play in the summer with more than 4 members of their high school team, comparable to what's done in other states, but particularly in other countries. And one of these people, a goalie from North Olmsted, helped propel the United States to the best result it's ever had in the World Cup to date. So, in a sense, the litigation was very successful.
You played a role in helping the U.S. World Cup
soccer. Yes. The reach of the ACLU is long and mysterious.
It's really fascinating. One person that you, I believe, had a close relationship with was Oscar Steiner. Could you tell us a little bit about your interactions with him?
Oscar was a financial supporter of the ACLU. He was an activist going back to the beginnings of the ACLU in Ohio when it was first organized. And he was a very gracious and thoughtful individual. He was somebody who would with his wife Dorothy extend hospitality to my wife Marcy and I, so we spent time at their house. We were at their lovely summer retreat in what's now the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. He loved to ask probing questions. Why can't we use the judicial system to solve all the problems about how youth are treated in this country? And I often found myself the apologist for a judicial system that wasn't set up to achieve such lofty goals. But I enjoyed the contact and knowing him over many, many years.
It seems in just talking about all of these people that you've met through the ACLU of Ohio and Cleveland that it was really sort of a family atmosphere. Is that accurate to say that?
I think to a significant extent it was. I don't want to say that there were not feisty curmudgeons or people that were quite difficult to get along with. But when I first came to Cleveland, I stayed with Ben and Judy Shearer. They put me up for about a month before I found an apartment. When I got an apartment, I had a nice loft apartment with absolutely nothing in it. Max Wall was like a dad to me in Cleveland. I mean, he set a wonderful example of how to stay organized and operate an office. He was incredible in that respect, but he was also so generous. He advanced me money to buy a dining room table and set of chairs. Not this one that we have here. We have replaced it over the years. When my Beetle needed supplementation because I was doing the Rights of the Institutionalized project and was going to have to drive pretty substantial distances, he co-signed a note so I could buy a car. I was a little surprised I couldn't buy a car without a co-signer at that point, but probably reflective of what I was making at the ACLU. As time went on, we expected our first child. Natalie Kern, who was volunteer bookkeeper, knitted a beautiful crib-size blanket for our daughter, Alexis. We shared recreation with other members, tennis with the Gersons, vacation with the Gersons, played tennis with Ed Lykover. For about 10 years, I bicycled downtown to work at the ACLU, which I continued about 10 years into my Cleveland State tenure. And I would have law clerks join me. At one point, there were 6 of us going down every day. The organization did get a little larger over time. So we would spend time with other people during holidays. And to this day, and this is sort of amazing, at the Cleveland State Law Clinics, the office manager is Jean Packard, who we hired for one of her first jobs at the ACLU. So I knew her when she was a young woman just out of high school. Now she's our office manager. She's a grandmom. And at my church, we have Loretta Dahlstrom, who, again, was an ACLU secretary as Loretta Nikolai. So wherever I go, I'm so well taken care of by people who have great memories of time spent together.
Wow. Well, in addition to everybody that you've met locally, you also personally met Roger Baldwin,
Yes.
founder of the ACLU, at the 1976 biennial conference. Can you talk a little bit about him and what he was like?
That was a great experience. The conference was at the University of Pennsylvania, which I attended, and where I dated my wife. And she was delighted to come back and participate and enjoy the conference. And so there was a reception listed for Roger Baldwin, and because I knew my way around campus, I was able to find it easily and got there quite a bit early. And it turned out he was really looking forward to the reception because he was there early too. So Marcy and I had about a half an hour with Roger before the reception began, and he was quite old, probably 94 or so, and had the look of somebody with 94 years, but a bright smile, beaming eyes, and a great optimism for somebody who'd been through such incredible struggles. If you think about 1920, when the ACLU was founded, the Espionage Acts, the Harding raids, widespread lynchings of African Americans. I mean, he came out of a terribly dark time through the union organization struggles around the Depression, tremendous amounts of violence in this country. And really, it was many, many years before significant headway began to be made. But he had been a great, almost prophetic executive director, and people loved him. So we had a nice time getting to know him. His basic message to me as a young ACLU worker was, whatever happens, you have to travel hopefully.
I like that. So that really made an impact on you, too.
It was great to meet him. I'd certainly read about him, but it was a treasured memory to spend time with him.
I want to shift a little bit to talk more about your legal activity. As I went over at our introduction, you certainly ran a gamut of different positions. You probably experienced a lot of different activities and litigations, but off the top of your head, what are some of the most significant that you worked on, some of the most significant cases?
The things that I think were most meaningful to me, history may have to judge significance, were the cases relating to the rights of the institutionalized, because they affected a number of different areas and really did have a significant impact. In the prison area, there were 2 major cases, Boyd versus Denton and Register versus Denton. Register was filed first. It was a comprehensive health care case for a class of all the inmates at Ohio State Reformatory, which was an ancient bastille built in the late 1880s, designed to hold 1,200 inmates. Ultimately held over 4,000 at times while I was working on the case. But the case was focused on the reformatory, but it had an impact on delivery of health services to inmates statewide. The practice at the time we filed the case was to do health care, even major health care, in-house at the prisons, which meant that often not the most qualified, and sometimes completely unqualified people were handling the care with multiple disasters. I mean, there were many people that were seriously injured or lost their lives as a result of inadequate health care in Ohio prisons. And so when the case was ultimately settled, Ohio agreed to have the health care provided by outside hospital facilities. So essentially, Ohio inmates began to get the same health care that Ohio citizens did, and it made a marked difference. Boyd versus Denton had a different focus. It intended to close the facility, so the case developed a little later, began maybe 5 years later, and people in the community actually have some awareness of this facility but don't know it. The facility was the setting for the popular movie Shawshank Redemption. All of the outdoor scenes in that movie were filmed at Ohio State Reformatory. The cell blocks for that movie were done at a mock-up at a factory in Mansfield itself and don't represent the facility. But the cell blocks were depicted in Air Force One with Harrison Ford. If you remember the scene where the Russian renegade general is released and there's a dark cell block with a lot of noise, and then he goes out into the courtyard and is shot at that point. That was the actual cell block at Ohio State Reformatory. And the East cell block was the largest freestanding prison cell block in the entire world. So if you picture 50 cages, double-sided, 6 tiers high, 300 cells, that was the East cell block. The West cell block was big too, 5 tiers high, but it was an incredible edifice that long had outlived its usefulness. It absolutely could not be secured. Once you started putting 2 inmates in a cell, all bets were off. And again, a lot of injuries, a lot of very sad and tragic occurrences. Ultimately, the case was settled, and there were improvements made over a period of time, and the state brought on a replacement institution, a modern, much better designed, easier to supervise Mansfield Correctional Institution replaced the reformatory. So that's the prison area. Okay. We also did a lot of work in the nursing home area. And there were, again, 2 kinds of cases. One was general conditions cases. There was a large facility at 82nd and Euclid, Abbey Nursing Home. There was another one, Emmanuel Care Center, across Carnegie from the Cleveland Clinic, that were very large, mostly Medicaid, that is poor people, nursing homes, and the care and supervision was not adequate. So in the Emmanuel Care case, Federal Judge Manos actually took the nursing home away from the owners and had it operated for 3 years by a receiver, with us responsible for coordinating the improvement. In the other one, there was an agreed injunction, and we spent many years, particularly Lois Robinson, who was staff counsel, and I, going there to monitor improvement. Ultimately, the case closed. The judge levied a massive fine against the facility, and that amount was split up and put in a trust fund and given to the patients, or in some cases their estates. So those were the conditions cases. The other area that we worked in was Medicaid dumping. What happened in Ohio was that new nursing homes that would open would take on a large number of Medicaid patients to fill their beds, And then as they were able to attract private pay patients at higher reimbursement rates, they would force them to leave. There was a phenomenon known as transfer trauma, technical term, but it's a dramatic increase in mortality and morbidity or illness among elderly people who are displaced from their homes. So it was more than just a change in where you live. People were actually harmed or sometimes didn't survive these moves. Some of the nursing homes would also take in private pay patients, and typically somebody would have lived their life, retired, they had a home, they sold their home. That money would pay for nursing home care. But when they'd outlived that money, the home might say, you must leave at this point, rather than allow them to transfer to Medicaid. And so we did a whole series of cases around this issue in conjunction with the Legal Aid Society. And the cases were important. In every case, we kept the named plaintiff in the nursing home. In every case, the judge refused to certify the case as a class. So whether we had 125 or 150 people, we could not get a class action certified. So basically, we'd win a battle but lose the war. But what happened as a result of this, the publicity around these cases, is the Ohio legislature became aware of the problem, and they modified the Ohio Medicaid statute so that any home that participates in the Medicaid program cannot transfer a patient based on Medicaid status. This is an important financial club, and basically it resolved the problem. It no longer occurs. There's still another area, and I'll deal with it briefly here, but mental health was an area where I did a lot of work. Two principal directions. One was discrimination in employment. Ohio had a practice in common with most other states of having mental institution inmates, and that's what they were called originally, not patients, perform institution supporting labor at munificent amounts that ranged from maybe 2 to 15 cents an hour. And they relied on these people to operate the institutions. I and Leroy Purnell, who's now the dean of Florida A&M Law School. At that point, he was a clinical professor at Ohio State University, brought a case in federal court in Akron on behalf of a man, Lawrence McKee, who had been involuntarily confined at what was then Hawthorne State Hospital, later Western Reserve Psychiatric Rehabilitation Center, since 1952. And had performed institution supporting labor for most of that time, up until a court in the District of Columbia held that people doing this had to get paid the minimum wage, at which point Ohio summarily fired all these workers. Okay, so here's a guy who'd, from 1952 to 1974, done all this work. Basically, he was working half-time the entire time and receiving a few cents an hour. The interesting thing from a legal perspective about this case is that because he was involuntarily confined in a state mental institution, the statute of limitations had never begun to run. It was told for the entire time. So Leroy Purnell and I crafted a case in which we sued the 3 Ohio cabinet members responsible for setting the wages for these people going back to 1952. We found them all over the country and sued them. And it was quite an adventure to do this case. Needless to say, just traveling around doing the depositions was quite an experience. But ultimately, ultimately the case settled, and it's a private settlement, but Mr. McKee was very happy, and the state changed its policy so they would hire these people at handicap wages. So that's one prong. The other one is there was a similar institution, Massillon State Hospital in Massillon, Ohio. Again, a very large institution, 1890s vintage, McKinley era. Again, meant to be a progressive institution, but had degenerated into basically a large warehouse. And so I worked under ACLU auspices, but also as designee counsel for the Ohio Legal Rights Service, to review the situation there. And ultimately what we did, rather than sue it, was we negotiated a comprehensive agreement for steps to improve that facility, which I then monitored over quite a number of years. And they were committed to doing that, and ultimately that was successful. Now, all those institutions have pretty much disappeared in Ohio, but it was a market change in one that was at least within my jurisdiction as rightfully institutionalized counsel.
Sure. Do you recall the name of that last case, the Massillon Institution?
What I'm saying is we never filed a case. Right. It was a private agreement. The other case was McKee versus Moritz. Okay.
Well, in addition to the rights of the institutionalized projects and mental health and the nursing home, are there any other civil liberties that you feel especially passionate about?
Well, I felt passionate about pretty much everything I was doing at the time. I think what was significant about what we were doing in the 70s and 80s was a lot of efforts to respond to uncover and in some ways heal the damage that was done by the late Cold War and anti-Vietnam War period. So this took a number of forms. At the extremes, there was a case, Vietnam Veterans Against the War versus F.B.I, which we assisted the national office in. Basically, what happened was that there was a chapter of the Vietnam veterans in Portage County, Ravenna, and there was an individual participating, Mr. Fike, who was pretty disruptive and ultimately offered to sell the group a grenade launcher so they could take some sort of aggressive protest action. They became so upset with this individual that they turned him into the police. It turned out he was the F.B.I. informant placed within their chapter. And so this damage action ultimately followed, and it was a major case and ultimately settled. In a similar vein, we handled a habeas corpus action to secure the release of Harlow X Jones from prison. You're nodding, so you have some familiarity with this case. Before, yeah. Harlow was a leader of a group called the Afro Set in Cleveland. He was a black militant. He was highly respected in the community. He was unlawfully convicted of second-degree murder and sent to prison, served 7 years in Ohio's maximum security facility before we got him released ultimately, which was really a miracle given the odds where we started. When I came to Cleveland in May of 1973, the cover story in the Cleveland Magazine was Harlow X Jones framed? And I took notice of that and spoke to Jim Willis, who was Harlow's counsel in the criminal case, and the U.S. Supreme Court had just denied review in his case, so the remedies on direct appeal were over. And so he wanted to know whether the ACLU could begin to do something at that point. I was completely new to the community, but Russell Adrian was a well-known and very respected member of our board of directors, long-time African-American lawyer, ultimately served as a judge on the tax court in Ohio. I spoke to him and asked him his read on the case, and he said he thought there really was not a basis for the charges. So we assembled a team of lawyers that included Gary Kelder from Cleveland State's legal clinic, Gordon Friedman, who was a young but well-respected criminal practitioner in Cleveland, Richard Ains, who was, I think, winding up a time as a law clerk, ultimately became a law professor and then dean of Akron Law Schools. It was quite a group of attorneys. Terry Gilbert, I think, was participating as a law student at this point in this effort, and began to work on the case, developed discovery. Fortunately, the case went to Judge Frank Battisti. He was a very courageous judge, handled the Cleveland school desegregation case. And ultimately, there was a week-long trial in that case. So at the trial, it was revealed that the police had a statement from a juvenile named Victor Harvey, which purported to be a complete description of everything that happened that was the basis for the case. The case had to do with one person being killed and another shot on the interstate in Cleveland after an incident at a McDonald's on the east side of Cleveland, at which a crowd became very upset. Harlow X Jones appeared at that incident and calmed the crowd and urged them to go home. And people had enough respect for him in the community that they did that. Later that night, these couple of shootings occurred. So Harvey's statement, Harvey was in the car from which the shootings occurred, and purports to be a complete description of everything that happened that night. Says that Jones went to the scene and calmed the crowd. It's not mentioned again until the end of the interview, where they show him a picture and ask, "Is this Harlow X Jones?" And he says, "Yes." Now, the prosecutor has a duty to turn over exculpatory evidence, evidence that would tend to suggest innocence, and a request had been made for this evidence that had never been turned over. Okay. The F.B.I. informant in the situation, Mr. Perry, was the admitted trigger man in the shootings. He fired the shots. He was indicted along with Harlow for first-degree murder. Harlow was alleged to basically have given an order for retaliatory shootings of whites based on the incident on the east side. The jury sensed that something was wrong. They came in with a verdict of second-degree murder. Now, if you think about giving an order to shoot people in retaliation, that's obviously first-degree murder. It's deliberate, intentional, pre-planned. But the verdict was second-degree murder. But they didn't have quite enough courage to do the right thing and acquit. And so Harlow went off to prison. The same didn't happen for Mr. Perry. A couple of weeks after Harlow's trial, the charges against him were dismissed. The admitted trigger man walked. He was given money by the FBI, and he left the state. So this came out at trial, and the judge ruled that the conviction under these circumstances violated due process of law and issued a conditional writ of habeas corpus. The state could have retried Harlow. They never did. There were appeals in the case, but Dick Ains went down to the Ohio penitentiary, and he was bailed out and came home. So that's one area of those cases. Another area was just to sort of find out what was happening, and we did that with Harlow, both with the discovery in the case and a Freedom of Information Act case. I represented Sidney Peck, who was a national anti-Vietnam War leader based in Cleveland, who worked along with Ben Spock as a local leader against the war in a case to get his F.B.I. records. I worked on another case with some volunteer attorneys, notably Eric Zagrins, then of Arden Haddon, in a case, I'm sorry, Eric Zagrins, I think of Han Loser, don't want to get the firms wrong, but in a case to get the ACLU records from the FBI, which were quite interesting because they indicated that going back to the 1950s, Cold War period, there had been some FBI surveillance of the ACLU and its meetings. So you would have a meeting at what was then the Union Commerce Building at 9th and Euclid Avenue, and the FBI would be outside, and they'd be writing down license numbers and identifying people who were attending the meeting. And those people included folks like, of course, Oscar Steiner, who was a regular, but they've also included William K. Thomas, later a United States District Judge in Cleveland, Jack Day, later State Court of Appeals judge for Cuyahoga County, who were active in the ACLU at this point. Obviously a group of people that posed a significant threat to the national security of the United States of America. And then last area that I'll mention quickly in terms of healing and follow-up was at one point Eileen Roberts, who was my successor as executive director, secured funding for a project on military discharge upgrading. We hired a young woman named Devore Moore who did paralegal work in support of that. Basically what had happened is going all the way back to at least the Korean War, a lot of servicemen had been discharged with what was called bad paper, dishonorable discharges, undesirable discharges, under questionable circumstances for a lot of reasons, either misapplication of regulations, racism, there are all sorts of issues in these cases. And because employers typically asked about your military discharge record, it was a significant impediment in getting jobs and moving ahead in the civilian economy. And so I never really expected to do any military law at all when I came to the ACLU, but I found myself studying the Code of Military Justice, and I was the only one who did these cases. I probably did 75 of them, appearing before panels or, in some of the cases, submitting papers to boards in Washington. And we had a good success rate with these, and they were very meaningful for the veterans in terms of relief and a change in perspective on life. In other words, people cried when they won these cases.
I want to shift gears a little bit, and then we'll head into our wrap-up questions. But in terms of community presence, you were involved with the ACLU for a few decades. Did you feel a shift at all in terms of respect for the ACLU and the work that the ACLU was doing? Did the public's view change a bit?
Well, I think the public is fickle, and its view waxed and waned to some extent. Around the time of Skokie, which was a case out of Illinois, there was a lot of public criticism and hostility with respect to the ACLU. That didn't affect us very much in Cleveland, at least with our own members, because people that were upset about representing Nazis that were ACLU members resigned when Ben Shear did the case I described earlier. And so we didn't experience much loss there. I think we were viewed as a substantial organization to be taken seriously. So, for example, in the mid-'70s, when President Ford announced an amnesty program that was designed to address some of the same issues as the later President Carter discharge upgrade program, I was asked by Channel 5 to do a feature on it, and I did a half-an-hour interview on Channel 5, answering questions, explaining the program, critiquing it. I appeared on WVIZ TV for extended periods to talk about ACLU issues. We frequently got calls from news media. Helen Baker, another active person who I didn't mention before, was a board member. She was a student rights advocate. She did a weekly radio program on WMMS, which was calculated to attract youth. By the way, she was the person with the 9 votes for executive director. She was a board member. She had the 9. So we became good friends. She ultimately went to Cleveland State Law School, graduated, and passed the Ohio bar. But wonderful, wonderful lady. The NAACP asked us to be an amicus in the school desegregation case, feeling that our brief would have some impact. And I can remember doing a brief on the issue of whether the state should help fund the remedy to desegregate the Cleveland schools. That was one of the critical issues in the case, and we submitted a brief on it. So we were small, but we packed a punch.
Well, looking back on all of your years with the ACLU in Cleveland and Ohio, you certainly have had a number of successes. Is there one certain success that you feel most proud of, or do you consider your biggest accomplishment?
I think probably the work that I described earlier with the Wrightsley Institutionalized project, because the impact was so significant on people's lives, and the work really extended over 20 or more years. I started the Register case, at least working on it, in the fall of 1974. And that case was still active when I left the ACLU in 1991. Bill Sachs, who'd been one of my law clerks, worked on it at that point. But I mean, I carried the Boyd case with me through the institutional close down after I left, and worked on it as a volunteer.
So you did serve as a volunteer attorney up through the conclusion of that case?
Well, I actually, when I left, again, there was a hiatus. Kevin O'Neill, who replaced me as legal director, I think didn't come on till May. And so we had an active litigation docket. So as a volunteer, I took the Boyd case, the OSR closed down. I took Anonymous Fireman with this versus the city of Willoughby, which was an HIV testing case. And I spent my first full week plus working for Cleveland State in trial in that case for the ACLU. I took the Rosen case, which succeeded in getting an independent ballot candidate designation on the ballot when you voted for a state representative candidate. And I took a case called Abby Gross versus City of Cleveland Heights, which is the case that's responsible for overturning the Cleveland Heights political sign ordinance. And I continue to work on all those cases.
Well, what have you been up to since you left the ACLU of Ohio?
Well, I have just completed 20 years of teaching at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. This past week, the trustees granted me emeritus status, so I guess somebody was pleased with the job I did. Thank you. I taught the employment law clinic. I published in the areas of civil rights litigation and faith in the law. And I provided some leadership to nonprofit organizations. I was the founding president of Christian Legal Services of Cleveland, which was a church-based legal aid program for the poor. And I was a long-time board member and ultimately president of Community Reentry, which is a ministry to ex-offenders. That's a Cleveland program, nationally recognized. I'm now a grandfather. My wife and I just celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary, which is a nice number to reach. And I am an itinerant hickory golfer. I play antique golf with old style clubs and sometimes 1890s style balls, and I do that around here and in several different states and in tournaments.
Do you wear 1890s type clothes too?
I actually wear a kilt. And if you want, I can display a picture for the archive. In the back in that age, knickers were very popular, okay. but as you know, I'm a Scot, and so there are a few players who wear kilts, as was traditionally done. So.
Fitting then. Well, is there anything else you'd like to cover or say about your experience with the ACLU of Ohio in Cleveland?
I think I've probably said enough. I appreciate your patience and your work in developing the questions, and I think you're a very fine historian and predict a wonderful career ahead for you.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for sharing your memory.